Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. This week, we're going to do something a little different. Jeff and I are just going to pontificate and share some of our experiences and let you, the audience, know more about what we're experiencing as we make this podcast. Jeff, how's it going today?
It's great, Chris. And honestly, it's nice to get to talk to you directly because we're always talking, but usually with somebody else in the room. So I'm really curious to hear about your experience and especially in the reentry to the US, what you've noticed in the differences in cultural, business attitudes, comparing your life in Europe now to reentry on the East Coast.
Yeah, I'd have to say, coming back home to the US and back into the DC area, um, it, it was a bit eye opening. So, we started the podcast, did over 3 years of this podcast out of Zurich, Switzerland, working in the energy business. I've got a really lot of exposure how Europeans think about energy, how Europeans think about climate change, and what they're individually trying to do to change things. Um, I would come back in and out of the U.S. I was in Houston quite a bit for work. Energy, you can't avoid Houston, New York, or anywhere that had energy, even Colorado, and and I'd interact with people in the energy business, so I could tell there was a delta between the thinking. But when I moved back, it really hit home how different Americans view energy than perhaps our European friends, and what we expect from energy and what's going on. And I'm amazed at the amount of pushback and politicism of energy because it becomes a very dividing political discussion with many people that you talk to.
Yeah, well, first of all, what I really like about the show, what I enjoy about your perspective and the framing here is that this is an energy show, not a climate show, not a political show. And even though we might have our opinions, the goal in the discourse is to hear more voices and to have a balanced consideration of multiple sides. So I really appreciate that. My personal motivation and perspective around energy is that it has the potential to be a unifying factor. So I certainly acknowledge that there's a lot of political rhetoric on either side, but what do California and Texas have in common? They're some of the largest renewable energy markets in the country. And so, who doesn't like cheap, steady, reliable power? So, I think that that is hopefully a unifying issue. And I try to bring that lens whenever I can.
Well, I think everybody likes power. Energy is important, right? Whether it be for the economy, for production, whether it be electrons coming into my home to light it, to keep my heat pump going or my air conditioning going, whatever I want to do. I think everyone's there. What I found is people aren't as excited to have things shoved down their throat. So for having done this podcast, I think I started pretty naive, and I've had people listen to the transition of me over the last few years during the podcast because you start and things are pretty black and white. Well, it's like, well, yeah, I don't want to have more hurricanes or I don't want to have more 100-year events. So, yeah, I'm willing to do something to have energy, be cleaner. And then you realize the complexity of changing things and the importance of the economy and quality of life and all the issues that come in. It's not simple, and that's one of the things I enjoy about the podcast is we bring people on during the pre-call. We always say, look, we're not investigative journalists. We want to hear what your points are. We want to hear what you have to say. Now, we all have opinions and we all, we might push back on something someone says, or we might let someone voice their opinion. But I'm of the belief is our audience is intelligent and that if you're exposed to the right data, you'll make informed decisions on your own. You don't need me driving my agenda down. And, in the pre call here, when you and I were talking, I was laughing about one of the guests we had on recently. I had someone come on in the comments and they were really upset that we brought this guest onto a podcast that really focuses mostly about energy transition and energy matters. And it was a guest that wasn't a believer and maybe all the things and pushed back a bit on a lot of the premises that we had, but yet we gave him airtime and spoke to him. And my thought was that you, the audience, would want to hear that. So that's kind of where I'm at these days with the podcast.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And I do obviously personally and globally think climate is a huge motivator, but also there are a lot of near term visceral motivators beyond climate. Like that is not the sole path to clean energy or energy transition. I love, by the way, it used to be alternative energy. and now it's energy transition. Now you almost have to specify if you're going to talk about fossil energy. So, but I think there's multiple paths to get here. Like many transition products, I use LEDs, EVs, rooftop solar. These are cases where it's literally just a better product. It is a better experience. An LED has more functionality than an incandescent bulb. I get that people don't like being told that they can't have incandescent bulbs, but LEDs are just better on multiple fronts. And you don't have to be into climate change to be into LEDs. You don't have to be into climate change to like the G forces of the acceleration of an electric vehicle. It's just a better product. And so I think there's, again, multiple routes into energy transition.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I was frustrated in the early days when LEDs were mandated, right? And they came out and you had to go buy bulbs and they were more expensive. Yes, they live a lot longer and maybe have better functionality and different light values. But it was a frustrating process to have that mandated. So, where my Americanism comes in is like, I don't like anything mandated. Free market works, right? Early in the process, we interviewed the CEO of Total Power in Asia, and he had come on and he made the point in one of our interviews that when solar became competitive, cost competitive, is when it really took off. It wasn't just the policy of a corporate board saying, hey, we want to be environmentally friendly. Yes, we'd like to do that. But with shareholder value and things like that, where their customer base really rocketed is when solar got to the point where the economics just made sense for a business to go do it. So I look at a lot of the energy topics that we cover and look at the business side of it and say, hey, it's a business angle, right? Um, Early on, I don't know if you ever listened to stories, but Will did a story. He was one of our producers on the show, friend of the show, and it was I cracked up because he came on, was co-hosting with me on an episode, and he just assumed because our guest was doing renewable energy that they were bleeding heart liberal, and he made some really liberal, crazy comment, and I kind of scratched my head. I was like, well, that's a big assumption. And the guy lit him up because he wasn't. He was just a businessman looking at how to do business. And it happened to be that his business goals and energy transition goals aligned nicely. And there was a nice revenue path there. So he was doing what many would consider the right thing, which others would just consider business. And it was funny just that, you can't just judge someone that's in energy, especially in the energy transition, based on politics, because I think you're going to get it wrong more often than you think these days, because as long as there's a solid business model, why wouldn't someone go do these things?
Yeah, I do agree. I think that it's more of a blurred line these days. There's a heavy amount of state investment. If we look at something like airlines, right, this is a case where you have a large enough and important enough infrastructure base that you have state level intervention. Boeing, Airbus, like these are things that don't just operate on the free market because they're big and important enough. I think energy infrastructure is one of those, and we're seeing post IRA a continuation of state energy policy, at least through the tax code. That certainly happened internationally with China, at least in the incentivization of manufacturing base. So these are more connected than I get. Maybe they've always been connected. That energy has always been a priority for state governments, and in some ways, the investment is there. Going back to the shale revolution that started with government sponsored R&D. So I see this as more of a connected rather than separated, but look, it's all in the mix. I think, it definitely exists at a level where not everybody has to be invested at every single level. It is possible to just run a business, talk to your customers, deliver them value, and not worry about all the macro and state level policies.
Yeah, I think you certainly will get comments if we start talking the politics and going in. But energy and politics go together because policy is fundamental. Energy security is fundamental to countries. The economy, it's fundamental. I think what I found moving back from Europe to the U.S. is we don't like to be dictated to. Right? You mentioned the airlines as an example. And if you fly in the summertime in Europe and you go on your plane, they can't fire the engines up until just a few minutes before you leave by ordinance in the country you're in. And so you're sitting in a 90-degree sweltering heat of a plane for energy, right? Whereas I think, an American perspective might be, is there a way to do that in a greener way and keep you cool and comfortable so you don't forgo the quality of life that we have?
Yeah.
But yet we have a heat pump on the ground that maybe pumps air in while you're sitting on the ground in the tarmac or whatever. Not that they don't have these things, but air condition is one thing, or flying in particular is another one. Americans like to travel. We're a free nation. We have passports. We go all over the world. And then the question is, where do mandates come in, right? Where's it your right to go do things, and where does it become for the
Hmm.
common good or whatever? And I think that's where the big difference is. I think Europeans are more apt to let their government dictate what they can do for what they believe a greener policy, than the United States. Whereas I think here we need to make the choice individually. We're trained to be, that we want to get what we want. Um, and so what you need to do is lay the facts out in a way that people can actually get them, which is getting harder and harder. And that's one of the reasons the podcast I think is so interesting. So that, if you're into energy and you want to hear about something, you can find data. We try to uncover things that aren't just on every energy podcast. We try to get, the finance behind it so you can look at the business. We try to talk about, emerging technologies or companies or business models. Those are things that to me are so fundamental to the success of energy that I
Hmm.
hope we communicate that to our audience week over week.
Hmm. Yeah, I hear that definitely from an American perspective of not wanting to be told what to do. These decisions are getting personal, though. I think earlier you brought up the idea of where people live or buying property, things like this. There's a real trend now where um, mortgage markets are being impacted because insurance companies are no longer interested in taking on Florida hurricane risk or California wildfire risk. And there's a trend of insurers just exiting mortgage markets. So they're not providing property insurance that is required by the mortgage lenders. So this determines whether or not you can get a mortgage, or influences heavily the sort of month to month costs that everybody has to bear. So that is more of a free market influence where actuarial tables, climate models are dictating the behavior of insurers, that's dictating the behavior of banks, and that's influencing where people live and buy property. So, in some ways, we'd like to not be told what to do, but you can't, yeah. Who am I to blow against the wind, right? Like whatever the weather is doing, that does in some ways dictate our behavior.
Yeah, I think it does. I think what I also see, and having grown up and gone to school here, people have seen this movie again and again and don't know what to believe. So part of the challenge you have of folks that are very, very strong believers in climate change and what energy should do and what people should do, and they're projecting that out. And so, if I recall, I remember my middle school science teachers telling me that by 2000 there wouldn't be any more oil in the world, and they were adamant about it. And there was all kinds of alarmist type things going on, and that the world wouldn't be there, and that my lifetime will be a really different place. And innovation and technology, like you talked about shale, when it got to a certain price, or getting harder to find reserves or uncovering reserves, were there. um, and so people that have seen this before don't see this as different, right? So there's folks going, well, why are we changing the energy? We're just changing the countries we're beholden to. So rather than pumping oil out, I mean, U.S. fortunately can be energy independent because we have a lot of gas and shale and other abilities. But you just change it. Now I'm going to Congo to get minerals, or now I'm going to where China's got battery control. So I'm really just changing the from the devil we know to one we don't know. That seems to be prevalent in a lot of these conversations I have with folks.
Mhm. Yeah, there's a book that I'm reading that I would highly recommend that talks about a couple of these different approaches. It's called The Wizard and the Prophet, and it talks about two different approaches to environmentalism. One that's a little bit more on the conservation side and alarmism, or doomerism as we're hearing it now, which is we're running out, we've got to conserve, we've got to stop doing all this. And then the other one, the side of the prophet, says we can engineer our way out of this problem. Whatever scarcity exists, we'll find more efficient ways, more efficient technologies. And it talks about the history and the origin of both of these perspectives and how they influence our approach. So the peak oil, what you referenced there, is more of the sort of profit, or for seeing, hey, the end of days, or we're all going to run out. And the wizard approach would say, well, no, we'll just find more ways of extracting. So I agree. I think that there's been a lot of alarmist narratives, limits to growth, population bomb, all these things in the 70s and 80s, that were more alarmist and really have proven to not really be the case. Um, that said, we are looking at maybe peak demand on oil, right? So it's another form, and in some ways frees us maybe from some of the geopolitical constraints. Boy, we're seeing now, it's great that we have more energy independence, but also more alternatives in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And agree with you on the critical minerals. Hopefully, though, we have some wizardly ways of innovating ourselves around that. And also on a mass basis, it's not great, but it's, definitely on a dollar and on a mass basis, I think much, much lower than the reliance on oil. So I take more of the optimistic approach there, acknowledging the challenges.
I mean, to me, the one thing that's fun is watching the emerging industries and watching everything evolve, right? So, I've been spending a lot of time in hydrogen, or if you look at future technologies, um, I guess a lot of people get wrapped around the wheel because solar and wind are primary what the big bets are today, right? And so there's people that don't like the solar fields, the amount of coverage, they're just not wild about that. I hear things about humming and risks and all kinds of different things that they seem to complain about. I haven't experienced that. Living in Europe, we had solar on the building, we had geothermal running our heating. There were a number of things in place that if you build the building from the ground up with, I think it's marginal cost to construction, and it makes sense. The right insulation, the right windows, and all the things that we know we want to do. It's there, but I- I'm looking for the innovation, and that's part of what excites me. So many of the folks like myself that came from technology, were in telecom, have moved over because so much of the energy transition is about software and managing and being efficient. For me, it's just a fun journey with what I believe is a positive outcome if we make the journey. Um, so it's interesting to see how it's going to go, and to continue to talk to innovators in the space, and also to talk to people that are more the legacy companies, the ones that are doing things that are there. Are they doing carbon capture? Are they keeping their turbines running longer? Are there things happening that we should keep an eye on? Because I don't think it's all the shiny new stuff. I mean, there's plenty in the pipeline that people are doing. Heat pumps aren't brand new. Maybe the technology that's advancing them is, and the software is getting better. But they're not a brand new invention.
I'm also really excited, Chris, for the technology piece, and an engineer. I started off in hydrogen, actually, way back when. Also, have worked on the software side. So I agree. I think that's what gets me excited as well. What is particularly encouraging compared to, let's say, 10, 15 years ago is, yes, while there is still a debate, there seems like much more alignment and less resistance. 10, 15 years ago, you still had oil companies and utility companies trying to put on the brakes or distract or divert attention or deny. I think now, like you said, you've got oil and gas companies investing in carbon capture, investing in geothermal. You've got utilities rolling out batteries to their ratepayers, to the customer base. And so it does seem like there's much more alignment globally around energy transition. This is happening. Yes, there's going to be questions about exactly which technology or incentive structures or business models, but it's all green for go. And I'm really excited to see where that goes.
Well, I am too. Just keeping this kind of short for this week, just to get a little perspective of what's going on. I think you got a little taste of how Jeff and I look at the world and what we're thinking about as we have guests on the program. Or if you have guests you want to hear on the program, please go on the website, suggest a guest. 90 some odd percent of our guests are by invitation only, but we do look for interesting guests and things that you want to hear. If they're topics that we haven't covered yet, drop us a note. Tell us what you want to hear more about. We're always looking for interesting companies, looking for interesting ideas, someone doing something unconventional, or even someone doing something at scale. Love to hear about that as well. Don't be shy. Um, just so you're aware, I'm off to a couple shows, so I'll be meeting a lot of folks in the industry. I'm in Las Vegas next week. I think a week or two after that, I'm back in Houston. So if you're in one of those markets, you want to catch up and meet us at a show, drop a note. We're happy to do that. Jeff, I think it's been good sharing a little bit of our insight today. Any final thoughts as we wrap up this episode?
That's great. I'll also be out at the Verge conference at the end of October. Looking forward to meeting people there, and we'll also post inviting guest ideas. And great to talk to you today, Chris. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, as always, it's great. We have fun when we catch up. For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed a little glimpse behind the scenes, and we'll talk to you again next week on Insider's Guide to Energy. Bye bye.